Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Wozniak. I'm the head of the Trade for Sustainable Development program with the International Trade Center in Geneva, and I'm joined by three of my colleagues, Indre Vaiskouskate from the European Commission, DG Trade, my colleague Petra Walterova from ITC, and also my colleague Madison Wilcox, from ITC. So we're going to be putting up a PowerPoint in just a second, which will take you through the agenda for this afternoon's webinar. This is the second webinar that we've had for interested cities to apply for the award. And we'll be able to, through this hour and a half session, we'll be able to really take you through the various steps for the application process. So maybe if I could just have the PowerPoint online here that we can work with, so we can then go through the agenda.
Joe, you should have it online. I'm sharing the screen where there's the PowerPoint. Madison, can you confirm if you see it? Yeah.
So the PowerPoint is shared from what I
very
can
good.
see.
Okay, now I see it.
This is good for people at home too on Zoom. They can you can change your view to gallery view or to view the presentation. So that's good for people to note at home when looking at the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, because it wasn't on my screen, but now it is. Great. So in terms of the agenda today, so what we'll do is just have a very quick introduction. Then we'll have really a very also a quick introduction or brief overview of the 21 edition of the award. As I mentioned, the biggest part of our webinar today will be really a very, very in-depth discussion and description of how to actually complete the application form online. And so my colleagues, Petra and Madison, will go through that. And then we'll have a final part of the session, which is Q&A. So any questions that you might have on what you've heard today, or any other questions that are related to the award, we can take those at the end. I would say, please, in the interest of clarity for all, please, those participants, please make sure that your microphones are muted and your video is turned off at this point, so we can make sure to have the bandwidth. Then when we go to the Q&A, we can do these via the chat room, so everyone can see the questions, and then we can take the questions step by step or one by one. So if I could have the next slide, please. And so I'd like to also at this point open the floor to my colleague Indre Vaiskouskate from DG Trade. Indre, you have a few remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome everyone. This initiative is very dear to DG Trade because it is part of our broader efforts to implement sustainable development goals I think in this current context where we have the crisis, the cities have actually even a bigger role to play because they are really responsible for their citizens' health, but they are also trying to make sure that they keep their businesses in place and there is a decent employment that it's still is still around in the cities. And from that perspective, I think we also look in the international trade angle and how our European cities also play a role in the value chains and supply chains, and how we for example, look into procurement, be it, for example, now in the case now for I'm very sorry. So we really look into how to make sure that, for example, the goods that we are procuring are responsibly produced and do take care of the international labor standards, or are also important for environment. So I think the sustainability, in our view, is going to be an important aspect of the recovery, and that has been seen in different policy briefs that had been issued by international organizations, or like ILO or OECD, that really see that the businesses that are responsible are actually doing much better during the crisis, because they can assess the risks. And so I think here the cities also have a role to play, and us as citizens, we have a role to play to raise this awareness and make sure that the sustainability aspects are taken on board. I don't want to take much more of this time, and because I think this webinar is really much focused on making sure that you can actually apply and introduce the activities that you are doing, and that I'm sure are going to contribute also in the future to well-being of everyone in the EU and also in the third countries, because it's also about international cooperation. And I give back the floor to ITC.
Thanks very much, Indre. And so, yes, just to say again, welcome. Thanks very much for your participation this afternoon on the webinar. I know these are difficult times, and all of us at ITC hope that you and your loved ones are doing well, and we thank you very much for your interest in our work. So just to be very, very brief in terms of the EU Cities for Fair and Ethical Trade Award 2021, what is it and who is it related to? So in terms of the cities, we're looking at cities that are larger than 20,000 inhabitants that are based in EU member states. And in terms of the application, any city stakeholder can launch the application. So it can be an NGO, it could be civil society. These organizations, these different entities inside a city can actually launch the application with the mayoral or municipal approval. And our colleagues Petra and Madison will go into the specific detail of how that is accomplished throughout this later part of the webinar. And what are we talking about? We're talking about a coherent approach to sustainable, fair, and ethical trade, and showing that approach, showing what that approach means in the city and municipal context in the application that you would submit. And this has really three main components: what your vision, strategy, and objectives are related to sustainable, fair, and ethical trade. What are the relevant policies that are being implemented or being put in place to actually, let's say, carry out to carry out or implement that strategy or vision. And then what type of impactful activities and initiatives have sprung up in the city or the municipality that deal with these types of fair and ethical trade type objectives. So those really are the three major points. Also, in terms of why would you be interested in doing this? This is the second time we're offering the award, and we found that we're working with the cities that applied last time, the cities that were also honorable or special mentions, and indeed the winning city of Ghent in 2018. Why the cities really have these feedbacks for us. One, it's prestigious recognition across the EU and indeed globally. Second, it's increased visibility of what that city is doing vis-a-vis sustainability and fair and ethical trade. It inspires local activities because you learn through this process of engaging with other cities and networks, including us at ITC and DG Trade, on how to inspire and improve different activities vis-a-vis fair and ethical trade and sustainability. Also, there is a cooperation project that is done in a third country in conjunction with ITC and DG Trade. So for example, with Ghent right now, we're implementing a project in India. There's also putting your city into what we have developed called the Sustainable Trade Champions Report, where you can then let's say, show and spread news and awareness of what you're doing at your city level vis-a-vis sustainability in a report that can be consumed by anyone, basically. And also to join an increasingly large network of cities that collaborate, they share experiences, share learnings related to sustainable and fair and ethical trade. And that's also part and parcel of the application process and working with us in this initiative. I should just say that the webinar today is not really aimed at kind of the why or the who or the what, if you will. That was covered on the 26th of March, just about a month and a half ago, when we had the first webinar, which really gave a lot of the A to Z, if you will, of the entire, let's say, City Award program. That webinar transcript, that video is available on the City Award website, which our colleagues will show you later on in the video, and the webinar, I should say. And you can go onto the website. You can view this 26 March webinar that has all the information related to the background of the project and the award itself. So I would just want to say that there's a lot of information already in the public domain, and that's readily available. So without further ado, I will turn it over to my colleague Petra and Madison to take you through the application process. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Joe, and Indre for the nice introduction. So I will try to go through part of the presentation, which will really focus, as Joe said, on the application process itself and specifically on the application form. So we will really go through the application form and its individual parts. And we'll try to give you a little bit of a greater sense of what is it that is important to mention in the application. So first, focusing on the application process itself, it's done entirely online. There is, some of you might have noticed on the website of the Trade City Award, there is an apply button that takes you directly to an online portal where that's really the page where you submit all of the inputs and any supporting evidence. So there is not much to download except for a mayoral declaration, which we will cover, but really everything is submitted there. So that's what we will focus a lot today. I should mention and put actually a lot of emphasis on the application form guidelines, which look like this, and we have them also available on the website. You will see in the online application form that we draw your attention to them also almost with every question. The application form guidelines really go through the entire application form from A to Z almost and guide you through the individual pieces of information that might possibly be useful to review and to use in your submission. So we will actually draw a lot of our input today on these guidelines as well. So it will look maybe a little bit like we're repeating ourselves, but we really tried to have all information as concisely as possible, but also comprehensively as possible included in these guidelines. So I would really draw attention to them. There are also rules of contest that are downloadable on the same web page of our website, which I would really encourage everyone as well to go through, because they this is something that is when you're submitting an application, if you do that, you're actually accepting these rules of contest. So it's really very important to review them. There are details about the evaluation process, for instance, the entire assessment. There are rules and kind of, you know, individual items about how we go about the benefits for cities. What is it that the shortlisted and winning cities are committing to as well if they are picked for this award. There's also, of course, considerations about the personal data and how we use them. So please review the rules of contest as well. In terms of language and which language you can submit the application in, it's really all 24 working languages of the European Union. Now, the application form guidelines will tell you that we encourage submission in English to facilitate the processing of the applications. You should know that the working language of the evaluation committee and the jury is entirely in English. So if you submit your application in another language, that's absolutely possible. The word count will then apply to that language, of course, but we will translate it for the work of the evaluation committee and the jury, and also any subsequent communication with the shortlisted cities and winning cities is done in English. The work of the network, for instance, where all shortlisted cities will be invited, is also carried out solely in English. That's why, let's say, English is encouraged, but it's not mandatory. It's just, I would say it's a good rule of thumb to use, to include an English speaker, maybe from a department in the city that would be, you know, kind of the owner of the application at the end of the day, who would speak English. That's something that proved really effective in the first edition of this award in 2018, and now we work with cities, and essentially the work is really carried out in English. The application form, we will go through it, of course, but it consists not only of questions, but the questions, the actual narratives can be supported by a few pieces of evidence. These can be usually documents, etc. You will see, we will actually go through in more detail through this, but the uploaded evidence really serves to support and substantiate the claims that I made in the application narratives. So you may want to think of that as well when preparing an application. They are not mandatory, the pieces of evidence, but sometimes useful. We are limiting them to 3 pieces per question, the big substantive questions, the 6 questions actually, not the context criteria. And the evaluators will receive not only the narratives, not only the textual application, but also these pieces of evidence. So in a way, they should be very much focused on the claims that are actually made in any of the questions that you're referring to. The application and the questions, the answers to those questions should be concise, if possible. We have word limits to each question, be it on the context criteria or the individual substantive questions. For each of these big questions, it's 500 words, and the overall application length shouldn't be over 4,000, more or less, words. Final point on the bulk of the application is really on the Mayoral declaration. Joe already mentioned that. While the application can be launched by another stakeholder, it should be submitted in conjunction with a city official, and the Mayoral declaration should be signed by the mayor, ideally, or deputy mayor, someone with a signatory power for the city, so that we know when we receive the application that the city itself knows that it has been signed up for such a contest, of course, and there is someone in the city as well who is very much in the loop. The template for this Mayoral declaration is downloadable. We will actually cover it later on. So now turning on to the application form itself, it consists of three, let's say, bigger parts. One is which opens it is really the city summary pitch. We'll go through the details of that. City context criteria, which are a smaller part, let's say, of the application, not so important, but yet a little bit important in terms of stating where the city comes from, the background of the city, so that the evaluators know about the size, and they kind of think a little bit about the overall positioning of the city. And then the major part, of course, are the 6 main questions. Maybe those of you who were one way or another already involved in the process in 2018, in the first award, you will notice that there's one question less. We have tried to actually streamline these questions comparing to the first process in 2018 quite a lot. So I can also say the application form this year is different from the one that we had in 2018, even though it overlaps actually quite a lot. So as I said, the application portal itself is available already on the homepage of our website, which you see here. So if you're not familiar with it, I would really encourage you to go through. There's also a lot of supporting information available on this website. Once you click on that Apply Now button, you are taken directly to our questionnaire and the signing up page, which is a different, it's a software provider called FormSite. And the setting up of the account, creating of the account is very, very easy. You simply need a username, a password, and an email address with which you create the account. As you see here, there is also a space for returning to the application, of course. We will also cover this in a little bit greater detail, but just as a heads up, when you create an account, it doesn't mean that you cannot come back to your application. You can also submit it, or you can actually also save your progress and then submit it later. Then the application tells you takes you to this page. The entire application form is on one page only. There is no clicking through individual pages. So normally it's really a lot of scrolling down. And we already include a few tips to help you through the application process, which kind of speak to how the form is really organized. So it should be noted that really all the fields are mandatory. If you cannot then answer one question for one reason or another, it's just important to explain why, so that there are no blank spaces, because then again you will not be actually allowed to submit the application. It's absolutely okay not to answer to all the questions as precisely as possible, of course, but it's encouraged, let's say, of course, to put as much effort as possible into each question. You can save your draft as many times as you want, but when you press submit, you cannot really go back, then it's submitted. So if there are any deficiencies, let's say, that you do not like, then there is really no way back. We will really only submit, we will receive the submissions once. For you to be able to submit, as we said a couple of times, you must include the signed Mayoral declaration, where there is a template for that. My colleague Madison will go through this part specifically. And the deadline for submissions currently is set to 12 June, 6 p.m. Central European time. So it's not midnight, as for instance we had it last time. It's really at 6 o'clock, and after that we will not be receiving any applications. First, you will be required to put a little bit more details about yourself. So really the person who is behind the application. So please note that we always will want to have one person to contact, of course, someone to call. It's why we're also asking about the phone number in case that there are any questions, and also very importantly for the follow-up afterwards, in terms of shortlisting, etc. So essentially the name that you put in here will be really the main focal point for any follow-up process in case of shortlisting, any other communications efforts, etc. So just something to pay attention to. And then when we scroll down, we are taken directly to section 1, the city overview. This is where we ask about the city summary pitch and the city context criteria, so the first 2 segments. For the city summary pitch, I would say that it's as important as the substantive questions, let's say later on. It, let's say, should provide the coherent story that you want to present with the entire application. You will see that the questions as they are asked, they really guide you to actually really come up with almost the story behind how your city approaches fair and ethical and sustainable trade. So I would say that in one short statement, you are encouraged to provide this compelling story behind the city's efforts. And this pitch is the part of the application that we will then use quite a lot in case you're shortlisted, or even for featuring your application afterwards in a Sustainable Trade Champions report, which Joe mentioned. So it's one that we really rely on actually quite a lot. So I would ask to spend some time on thinking how to pitch really the submission that you would like to provide us with. In terms of the city context criteria, now this seems a little bit daunting because there is a lot of questions that we ask, but the responses should be really, really short. We are asking these context criteria just to make it quite clear for the evaluators how the city is big, how many citizens, of course, it has, what's the overall positioning of the city, whether it's rather a young city, a student city, etc., etc., etc. How innovative even it is, what sort of, for instance, city networks it is part of, if you already won any other awards, for instance. All of this might be important to frame the overall application. So it looks like it's a lot of information, but we really don't want you to spend too much time on it. You will see in the online application form that while all of the text boxes are really marked with asterisks, so they're actually mandatory to put some information in, you see in this guidance above that only a few of these bullet points are actually with an asterisk. So it's really those who are, let's say, mandatory to include in the text box. So if I really go, here, the first 2 bullet points, size of the city, surface area, that's not so important, by the population size, yes, we really would like to know, at least to, again, as I said, frame the application. So you see here as a kind of an example how it could look like. This is already very developed, even the couple of bullet points that we're asking as mandatory are really important. Same thing goes for the economic structure. This can be also quite daunting. This should be normally readily available information to any city. So again, it's only those that are marked with asterisks that are actually mandatory to use. International trade infrastructure. Here actually it looks like it's a mandatory question. We'll change it because you will see in the application form guidelines that it is actually not mandatory. Nevertheless, since this is a trade award, of course, we're also asking a little bit of a background on the international trade side. So by that, we really mean that we would like to hear whether there's any extra EU trade infrastructure, like port facilities, if it's a port city or not, for instance, if there's a major international airport. Already that is an important and interesting piece of information for the evaluators to know. Whether there is any interconnectedness really with the external world as well, etc. So all of this is actually quite interesting. I included here an example from the winning city last year. The context criteria looked a little bit different. We had actually 2 sections here, trade structure and infrastructure. So we merged these together, and you literally only have 150 words for this text box, as for any of the others actually in the context criteria. So these are really, really concise, short answers with only the most important facts. So if you, for instance, take a look at the trade structure here and you see this paragraph, that's approximately the length of what it is and what Ghent put in there. So this is that. The next one that we're asking, and that's actually here, it's not marked as important, as mandatory, but it is. So we will also change that actually in the online form, because we actually really would like to know whether you are part of, whether the city is part of any networks of cities or related networks, as well as, for instance, whether you won any relevant city awards, for instance, or awards related to projects that the city, for instance, implements, and so on. So we included a list of possibilities. Of course, this is not to say that you have to include all of them. It's really only those that are very relevant. There might be also other ones. So this is only literally to give you an idea of what is it that we mean by such city networks, and winning of any previous awards, for instance. So even this list, for instance, I think I counted this something like 70, 80 words. So here, this should be a super, super concise answer. If you would like to possibly mention any twinning activities, for instance, with other cities, it also could be mentioned specifically here. Finally, on the sustainable development frameworks, it's also actually a mandatory question where we're interested in knowing whether the city subscribes to or is guided, in its policymaking and implementation by any national or regional policies and frameworks on sustainable development specifically, either really specific to trade or generally to SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, or the broader agenda for sustainable development. This is really a big part of the award, of course, the connection to sustainable development as a whole. So I would really encourage to actually provide as relevant information as possible under this specific segment. Again, it's only the basic facts that should be stated. You don't have to think about the narrative itself. It can be even just in bullet points. So this is really the section 1 on the city overview. Generally, I would say that more effort should be put into the city summary pitch in the very beginning. Usually cities, from what we understood in the first edition, they would actually create this one only at the very end when they saw, of course, the answers to the general application. And then they really came up with the most important points. And the city context criteria, again, I'm just going to repeat, they are not so important in terms of the time and effort spent into that. So, but they should really serve to frame the application in a good way, so that we know whether we are dealing with a rather large city, rather, let's say, connected city or less, etc. There is no right or wrong answer to those questions. We're just really interested in basic facts and how you present them as a city, of course. In section 2, this is really where we get to the business, where we start with the substantive questions. When question 1 is the opening one that really sets the tone, let's say, for the entire application. So we're really asking about the city's vision or objectives for sustainable, fair and ethical trade, whether there is a specific strategy in place, so something that could be official or even at least as a for instance, a work plan for the city. And this is a new aspect comparing to the first edition of this award. We're also asking what is the city's motivation to become a leader on sustainable, fair and ethical trade. So it's really to kind of dig a little bit deeper down into the, let's say, overall drive of the city for sustainability, either as a whole and specifically really focusing on sustainable, fair and ethical trade. So here the response should really highlight the relevance of sustainable trade in the overall city approach to sustainable development. And then You can also, I should mention that you don't necessarily have to describe only the current situation, but you can also provide, let's say, the aspiration or the future plan. So for instance, if there's a strategy in the making, something that's been discussed, then definitely do mention it. If there is, let's say, a stakeholder engagement process, for instance, in place, I don't know, a forum being created for this to consult various stakeholders on this, also important information, for instance, to mention. So the statement of vision and long-term objectives can be mentioned here, even medium or short-term targets, the actual strategy as well, including if the strategy, for instance, links to some other sustainable development guidelines or documents. And as I said, of course, explain a little bit the motivation in 1 or 2 sentences at least in terms of how the city is driven to do this. We'll move to question 2, which, let's say, trickles then down a little bit by 1 level. And from the strategy and vision, we really go to the more implementation stage, where we ask about the policies, systems, or actions that the city might implement in the area of fair and ethical trade. Don't focus too much on the definitions behind these, of what we mean by actual action, systems, policies. Again, in the application form guidelines, we've got an entire list of what this might mean. I will mention actually some of these examples as well. But these should really focus on what the city itself does in this area and how it really shows the city's engagement in the area of fair and ethical and sustainable trade. The second part of the question, do any of these extend to the supplying communities and producer countries? That's there because we would like to see as well whether the policies take any consideration of this connectedness of the city and maybe how the products, for instance, get into the city through the supply chains that usually originate in our global world these days, you know, to producers elsewhere and especially in developing countries, and then how it affects possibly their livelihood or the environment of those that actually produce these goods. So it's to see more or less whether there is a consideration to that in those policies. And in terms of the examples of what could be mentioned here, and this doesn't have to be, it's not an exhaustive list, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that, you know, if you don't have any of these or not all of them, it doesn't mean that you cannot answer this question. But in terms of what we thought would be useful to mention is really public procurement policies, any appropriate guidelines on how to implement sustainable public procurement, training for city officials on this, on sustainable procurement, collaboration in city networks as well, to exchange information on sustainable public procurement or even other issues, of course, as well. This might even span, for instance, to climate change and similar topics. Any written policies evaluating supply organizations based on their social and environmental performance. So this would be really the part, you know, responding to the second part of this question. What might be the percentage of the budget allocated to sustainable procurement or tenders that include criteria on sustainable, fair and ethical trade, any regulation or taxation policies that promote sustainable trade in the city, as well as any twin city or international cooperation, even with, you know, development angle. These sort of initiatives can also be mentioned here that would be really meant by the actions, for instance. And seeing, for instance, that there is some sort of a system behind them, of course, creates a very, let's say, compelling part. Then, you know, if the city is able to have that, or is really thinking in a kind of wider terms as well. What I haven't mentioned before for the question 1, 2, and of course the rest, you can upload, again, here as you see, supporting documents. It's really uploading documents, so it's PDFs, it's Word documents, photos, videos even. I'm not sure about the limit, actually, the size limit of these. We will double check that, and we should probably have it included so that it's crystal clear to everyone. But this would be, for instance, that as well, if there's a document of a strategy or with the policy, it would be actually nice to have it really backed by an actual evidence. So if you say in the text bar that this is what you have and this is what the city implements, then have it backed by that piece of evidence. I will move over to question 3, because this is really where the story kind of starts to, I would say, emerge. from the entire application, because we then ask, it's a similar part to question 2 in a way, but we're asking, how does the city promote awareness of and support for sustainable, fair and ethical trade among its citizens? How do these efforts reach different groups of society? And then whether the city creates an enabling environment for other efforts and initiatives to thrive. So here it's really about seeing and kind of detangling and shedding a light, let's say, on the city's efforts to build knowledge and increase the awareness of fair and ethical trade in cities towards citizens. And when we ask about different groups of society, citizens are also businesses, are also the civil society inside the city, you know, different other stakeholder groups, even church, for instance, etc., schools. You know, you can even kind of segment society in seeing whether there are some activities specifically focused on the young generation, for instance, as opposed to the rest of the society, etc. So these are really the types of, let's say, answers that we would like to see. Generally, we would like to see, or what you can consider to include here are the different awareness raising campaigns, fairs, festivals, workshops, seminars, even information materials, online guides or printed guides, you know, for related to sustainability in the city, any technical or financial support for projects that would, you know, let's say, promote sustainable trade in the city. So that already relates to the creating of enabling environment for these sort of initiatives in the city, providing of meeting spaces or forums, for instance, for free of charge for meetings that are organized by other stakeholders in the city, any city sponsorships, for instance, or other city government endorsements, etc. I would like to say at this point that you will see actually a lot of examples of this, what this concretely means in our Sustainable Trade Champions report. So I would really encourage you to also possibly take a look at it, at least, and scroll through it. It's where we organized many of these initiatives, you know, in a very categorized way. So hopefully you can get an inspiration from the cohort that applied for the City Award in 2018. And there's really, really a lot of inspiration, even, you know, if you decide not to submit an application, just to actually to take action even. So these are very, very nice examples, and it really gives you a good overview of what we mean specifically by this question. I will hand it over now to Madison, who will cover the rest of the application form then.
Thank you, Petra. Thank you for everyone for participating. So I will take you through the back half of the questions in the application form here, and then also we'll get into some of the key takeaways at the end and also some of the details when it comes to submitting the application. So moving on, we are now in a new section, section 3, which really moves beyond what the city is doing itself, the city policies, the city objectives, and looks more at the business and civil society organizations, what they're doing within the city ecosystem. So you can see the question here, it's quite self-explanatory. So what are specifically organizations outside of City Hall, so businesses, CSOs, educational institutions, what are they doing to promote and spread sustainable, fair, and ethical trade? So this also naturally flows from question 3, because question 3 focused on what the city is doing to create a beneficial ecosystem. So question 4 focuses on within that ecosystem, what are businesses, what are CSOs, what are other institutions doing? So what are they doing to lead and to develop different initiatives to support sustainable trade? And in addition to that, how is the city perhaps supporting those initiatives that outside stakeholders are leading? And this is very important because we want to be able to see that within these cities, it's not just a one-way approach to sustainability, that really there's a vibrant ecosystem of many different actors working on this issue. So in terms of the information to provide, I mean, I went over it just a bit already, but the overall environment concerning fair and ethical trade inside the city is good to highlight. The question, the answer should really highlight which businesses, which NGOs, which CSOs are active, who they are and what they're doing. And it's also beneficial to highlight if there are, for instance, multi-stakeholder initiatives that bring together the private sector, the public sector, different CSOs, civil society, in order to have a concerted effort to promote fair and ethical trade. And finally, tying into this question is how these efforts affect supplying communities in third countries, since that is very much one of the main goals of fair and ethical trade and sustainability in general. So some examples of what you could provide, these are provided in the application guidelines, but just to go over a few of them now, you could highlight how, if businesses are posting information and how they're making their compliance with sustainability more visible, whether it's through voluntary standards or implementing different codes of conduct. You can highlight if there is an NGO in your town that has a big ad campaign, or perhaps a fair trade market or different events that they're working to promote fair and ethical trade in your city. So overall, it's more about what organizations outside the City Hall are doing. One final note on this question, and this was highlighted to us by applicant cities to the first edition of the award, that it's good to start working on gathering the information for this question early, because through this process, cities may be putting out surveys or maybe asking for inputs from different civil society organizations or businesses that they know are very active in sustainable trade. And this process can take a little bit of time, but outside of even the award application itself, it's good for the city to be able to track these things and to get the most updated information on everything going on in their city in this area. So as we are about a month and a half away from the application deadline, it's good to already start looking at that, collecting information for that. Moving on to the next question, we're looking at observable effects of the city's activities. So this question really focuses on any evaluation systems or measurement systems that have put in place by the city, and what some of the observable effects of those of the activities they've found. So I would really look at this question in two main points. First, if the city has put in efforts to develop any kind of monitoring system or evaluation system for their sustainable, fair, and ethical trade promotion activities. There could be different innovative approaches. They could be collaborating with, for instance, universities or different institutions to come up with systems. So there are some great examples of this in the Sustainable Trade Champions report as well. So I would encourage you to look at that. And then beyond just looking at what cities have done to create measurement systems, also looking at what the actual observable effects are. So that could come from these evaluation systems. Some examples that could be quite simple, for instance, if the city has directly committed to having more sustainable public procurement, they can show that over a certain number of years they've increased their public procurement sustainably to a certain percentage, or expanded it among a different range of products. They can also have business surveys where they show businesses in their city that have implemented more sustainable practices. So in general, it's both the evaluation systems and any observable effects that they can show from these evaluation systems. Another note, this question is, while it's important, it's not weighted as much in terms of the final evaluation score by the evaluation committee as much as the first 4 questions. So this is because the award really, in terms of what it's looking for, it prioritizes actions and initiatives first and foremost, and then having observable results and evaluation systems is really going above and beyond. So it does have an effect on the overall score, but the first 4 questions are weighted a bit higher than this question is itself. And moving on to question 6. This is on the future initiative. So as you would know, if you've done a bit of research into the award, And as Joe mentioned earlier, the award for the winner of this project is of this initiative is a development cooperation project that is that in the area of sustainable trade that is funded by the European Commission in terms of the expenses to undergo the project up to 100,000 euros, and then ITC provides technical support and management of the project funds in order to carry out the award project. So this question is meant to get at least the beginnings of an idea of, if your city were to win the award, what that project or initiative would be. And I think it's important to note that the evaluation committee and the jury, they're not expecting a fully fleshed out project plan with details around all the different deliverables and specifics for timelines and things like that. But it would be very good to have some sort of concrete idea of what the city would like to do based on their experience. So if they have a lot of experience in a certain sector or with a certain part of the world, what they are inspired to do with this kind of opportunity, this kind of access to resources in order to implement a project, and why they want to do so. So here, it doesn't need to be a full project plan, but still it's good to try to be specific about what the city would like to achieve. So how it's linked to the city's background. For instance, with Ghent, the winner of the first award, they had mentioned how they have a long-standing history as a textile producer in the past, and then as an importer, as a hub for Europe. So, and that's connected to their current desire to do this project and this current project that's going on in the textile sector in India with Ghent. So the guidance note really highlights exactly what you should be putting in that section, but think of the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why when you're filling it out. Also, a final note on that section is that the development cooperation project question isn't weighted in terms of the overall evaluation score. So it actually doesn't have an effect on the overall score of the application. However, it's important to put in there and have a clear idea, because it can influence how the evaluation committee and the jury look at the applications and eventually chooses a winner. So it's good to have some good ideas in there, but it's not scored in the same way. So moving beyond the questions here, we're to the mayoral declaration. So this is also, all of the text that we have there is very important for the cities to understand. Since this application, we've made it so that it can be filled out by a company or citizens outside of City Hall. We want to have it so that we ensure that there's city buy-in for this project, because as Petra mentioned, the cities will need to be in correspondence if they're to be part of the network, if they're to carry out the development cooperation project. So it's really important that there is buy-in from the city from the City Hall in order to represent the city in this award. So as part of that, we have a mayoral declaration form which needs to be submitted in order for the application to be valid. The downloadable form is available on the website. So we encourage cities to download this form and start the process for getting this signature, this mayoral declaration, early, because as we know, City Hall processes can take some time. There might need to be a vote or some kind of authorization. So it's good to make sure that you start early to ensure that the mayor or the deputy mayor or whomever else is can have signatory power for the city in this capacity is able to sign the document. We recommend that cities download this template here and have it signed and then upload it to the application. Last time there were some applications that had their own formats. We would just prefer that you use this document itself to avoid any issues if the wording is different on the mayoral declaration, for instance. So as you're filling out the application, Petra mentioned before, but the cities, you do not have to fill out the entire application at once and then submit. In fact, we encourage you to go on, create a profile, maybe start filling out some of the basic information on the city context, but you're able to save your progress on the application and return to it as many times as you want to submit the document. So as with any document, make sure you're clicking the Save Progress button before you sign out so that all of your information is saved there. But again, we encourage you to go on now to make a profile to get an idea of what the application form looks like, and then you can always save your progress and come back later. And so here, as Petra showed you earlier, you can create your profile as a new user, but once you have a profile, you just return with your username and password and sign in. And then you'll be able to access your same application and go through step by step with editing. Once you are done with your application, you have to save your progress and then submit the application and click the Submit button at the bottom. Again, once you submit the application, it is complete. You're not able to change it. So make sure that everything is finalized before you submit. Also, when you submit the application, you agree to the rules of contest. So it's important to review those beforehand. Another note on this, I would encourage you not to wait until the last day to submit because there can be technical issues or people might not be available in the last days. So and you don't want to miss the deadline because then there can be difficulties. So I encourage you to leave some breathing room and try to submit at least a little bit before the deadline. So some key takeaways just to review. This is in many ways what Petra talked about at the beginning, but it's good to review as we reach the end of the formal presentation here. Again, you can apply in any of the 24 working languages of the EU, but we encourage English because the form would need to be translated into English, and all of the review is done in English, and then also any follow-up with the city, any of the activities with winning cities are done in English. Applicants should try to answer all of the questions as precisely as possible, but the most important facet is that the city should try to put together a coherent and well thought through application. It's okay if the city doesn't have tons of examples and a lot of specific points for every single question, but the city should really try to have a coherent application that shows the overall direction quite well. Petra mentioned before that each question has a specific word limit. So the word limit is based on the original language of submission. And this is to ensure that the applications are quite concise. In fact, I think you'll find that it shouldn't take too long to fill out this application. We've tried to make it very logical and very concise for both the applicants and for those who would be reviewing the application. And then finally, it's important to start your application as soon as possible so that you are able to get an overview of the applications, but then also perhaps start to work on some of the questions that might take a bit longer. For instance, I mentioned question 4 on the city ecosystem. You might be reaching out to local businesses or CSOs in order to collect information. You might need to go through certain processes in order to get the mayoral declaration. So it's good to at least create a profile now and then give yourself some time to understand how much time you need to finish the application. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. Thank you everyone for participating. I don't know if Petra has anything to add on key takeaways, but at this point, we would like to open up to questions. So please feel free to ask your questions in the chat box of the Zoom at the bottom of the Zoom page, and we would be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Madison. No, nothing really to add from my side. You covered it really comprehensively. Maybe one other just complementary information, the limit for the evidence for the uploads of the documents that would support the individual questions is 100 megabytes. So maybe that's just that. And also when you're submitting, when you're putting in text, I would really encourage you to save progress as often as possible, just to make sure that also there is not any idle time, for instance, allowed for, because then it's a good, let's say, insurance policy to do that. So we're waiting for your questions. I will escape from this presentation then, and we still have several minutes, so please feel free.
And again, you can, yeah, exactly. Put your question, please, into the chat box for everyone to see, so then we could read them out. The chat box is on the bottom of your screen in the center.
I don't see anyone typing. So maybe before we close the webinar, if there's someone who would like to have a question directly, would like to speak up, please do so now. We can allow for 1 or 2 questions directly as well. Or of course, the other option is to always contact us through the email that's available on the website. Those questions go directly to the Secretariat of the award that's supporting this webinar today, of course. So please feel free also to submit your questions through this means. It's always available. There's also a phone number mentioned that you can call if that's easier for you. So of course, you know, if you don't have any immediate questions, which is actually quite nice because it means that we were very, very clear in our presentation. So please feel free to do it later. But again, we are almost a month and a half before the submission deadline. So if any of your cities, any of you are thinking of starting to work on the application, this is a really good, let's say, time to start and start really putting the application together.
I see one person is trying to connect to audio, it looks like. That person can feel free to write in the chat box as well if the audio isn't working. I'll also say that we will likely have one more webinar towards perhaps in a month's time or so to go over any last minute questions before the submission deadline, which is June 12th. So a lot of the questions that we'll get over the next few weeks we'll be answering in that webinar as well.
Okay, there seems to be no one really raising any questions. So since you opened the webinar, if you can also close it. I thank you very much, everyone, for your attention, of course. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks also Madison and Petra for walking everyone through the application form and the different questions and aspects of it. Again, we're here to take any of your questions after this call, as Petra and Madison indicated. We look forward to hopefully receiving your applications by the deadline. And again, a lot of information is on the website. Also the previous webinar that goes through more or less the concept, if you will, of the award. So please reach out to us if you have any questions. We're here to answer your questions at all times. So thanks again. Take care, stay safe, stay healthy, all the best, and we look forward to seeing you online. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Excuse me, Joseph, I see that there is one question from Gothenburg.
Great.
Yes.
Okay.
It says that we have been very clear, which is excellent. Thank you very much, Jesper.
Okay.
Apologies.
Oh, very good. Okay.
And
no worries.
Gabriela Ceccarelli from Umbria as well. So she also says that everything has been very clear. So we're very happy to hear that, of course. Perfect. Let's see again if once you start going through the application process or your cities, please just let us know if there's something that really comes up and something is really not super clear. Again, take a look at the guidelines. I think that they are really helpful in terms of navigating the application form. Also very clear. It's one segment by each question. So hopefully this could be helpful.
Indre, I see your video. Do you want to say any final words?
Thank you very much. I think thank you to ITC for explaining it very clearly, and thank you to Frenos for organizing the webinar, and thank you for everybody joining it. And we're really looking forward to receiving many applications. So I can just encourage you to start your work.
Thank you very much, Indre.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.